pack your stuff and get out by Friday, or I'm calling the sheriff. Marcus Thompson's voice echoed through the modest two-bedroom apartment as he waved an eviction notice at the single mother sitting at her kitchen table with her laptop. I don't rent to welfare cases who can't pay rent on time. This building is for working professionals, not broke single moms living off government handouts. What, Marcus? Didn't know? What this slumlord was too busy being classist to notice was that the welfare mom he was illegally evicting was actually Jennifer Liu, founder and CEO of CloudSync Technologies, worth $43 million, who'd been living in this rundown apartment building for 3 months, while secretly documenting the horrific living conditions and illegal practices that Marcus inflicted on his low-income tenants. And what Marcus definitely didn't realize was that Uncle Sam, had been working undercover as the building's maintenance supervisor for those same 3 months, helping Jennifer gather evidence that would eventually destroy Marcus's entire rental empire and send him to prison for housing discrimination. Bro, you see, I met Jennifer through unusual circumstances. She hired my security consulting firm to help her investigate predatory landlords in the Bay Area. And what started as a professional engagement turned into an undercover operation. When we discovered just how extensively Marcus Thompson was exploiting vulnerable tenants in his 14 apartment buildings across Oakland. Jennifer wasn't just gathering evidence for a lawsuit. She was building a case that would expose systematic housing discrimination and protect hundreds of families from the kind of exploitation that keeps poor people trapped in poverty. You know, before I tell you how this landlord's classist assumptions backfired so spectacularly that he lost everything, including his freedom, let me ask you something real. Have you ever been judged or mistreated by a landlord who assumed you were poor, uneducated, or undeserving of basic housing rights? Drop your city in the comments and tell me about the worst landlord situations you've experienced or witnessed, because what happened in that Oakland apartment building is gonna show you exactly what happens when predatory slumlords meet someone who has both the resources and the determination to take them down completely. Now, if you'll pardon an old man for taking a moment here to settle into this story, cases involving housing discrimination and landlord exploitation always hit me in a particular way. At my age, having watched how slumlords treat low-income tenants, always assuming they're desperate enough to accept terrible conditions. Too poor to fight back legally, I've learned that some of the most vulnerable people are also the most resilient when someone finally stands up for their rights. Thank you for staying with Uncle Sam as I tell you about one of the most satisfying takedowns of predatory landlord practices I ever participated in. To understand how Jennifer Liu ended up living undercover in a rundown or running a $43 million tech company, we gotta go back about 5 years. To when her own mother was being exploited by a different slumlord in San Francisco, Chinatown, facing illegal rent increases and threats of eviction despite rent control protections that should have prevented both. Jennifer had grown up in that same Chinatown apartment, raised by a single mother who worked double shifts as a restaurant cook to provide for her daughter while living in a cramped studio with broken heating, water damage, and a landlord who routinely violated housing codes because he knew his immigrant tenants were too scared to report violations. Jennifer's mother, Grace Liu, had immigrated from Taiwan in 1985, working grueling service jobs while saving every possible dollar to give her daughter opportunities Grace herself had never had. My mom never complained about our living conditions. Jennifer had told me during one of our planning meetings. She'd work 12-hour days in restaurant kitchens, come home to an apartment with no heat in winter, and just tell me to study harder so I can have a better life. She accepted terrible housing because she believed that's what poor immigrants deserved. That speaking up would just get us evicted with nowhere else to go. Jennifer had excelled academically despite the challenges of growing up in poverty, earning admission to UC Berkeley on full scholarship and completing a computer science degree with exceptional grades. She'd worked at several tech companies after graduation, rising quickly through engineering ranks before launching her own startup CloudSync Technologies in 2016. a cloud-based data management platform that had grown explosively to serve thousands of corporate clients. By 2019, Jennifer's company was valued at over $80 million, with Jennifer personally worth approximately $43 million between equity holdings and salary. She'd achieved the kind of success that should have meant her mother could retire comfortably, stop working those brutal restaurant shifts, move to better housing. But when Jennifer tried to help her mother relocate from that Chinatown studio, she discovered that Grace was facing a legal eviction from the landlord who'd been exploiting her for over 30 years. The landlord claimed my mom owed back rent that she'd actually paid, Jennifer explained. He'd been pocketing her cash rent payments without providing receipts, then claiming she hadn't paid so he could threaten eviction and charge late fees. When I got lawyers involved and demanded documentation, he retaliated with harassment and intimidation tactics designed to force her out. Jennifer had the resources to fight that particular landlord legally, eventually winning a settlement that allowed Grace to relocate to decent housing with protections against retaliation. But the experience had opened Jennifer's eyes to how extensively predatory landlords exploited low-income tenants who lacked resources to fight back, keeping security deposits illegally, charging for repairs that tenants weren't responsible for, ignoring health and safety violations, using eviction threats to prevent tenants from asserting their rights. I realized that what happened to my mom wasn't unique, Jennifer told me. It was systematic exploitation that landlords like hers inflicted on thousands of vulnerable tenants, immigrants, single parents, people with criminal records, anyone who seemed too poor or too scared to fight back legally. And most of these tenants had no idea they had rights or how to enforce them, even if they did. That realization led Jennifer to start funding tenant rights organizations throughout the Bay Area, providing legal services for low-income renters facing exploitation or illegal eviction. But funding legal defense was reactive. It helped individual tenants after they were already being harmed. Jennifer wanted to do something more proactive, something that would expose predatory landlords before they could victimize more people. That's when she decontacted my security consulting firm with an unusual proposal. She wanted to go undercover as a low-income tenant in buildings owned by landlords known for exploitation, documenting violations and illegal practices while I worked as building maintenance to provide technical support and additional documentation. It was part investigative, journalism, part legal evidence gathering, and entirely focused on taking down slumlords who thrived on exploiting vulnerable people. I know this sounds crazy, Jennifer had said during our first meeting about the project. A tech CEO worth millions voluntarily living in slum housing to document landlord violations. But I can afford to take the time away from my company. I understand poverty from having lived it. And I am angry enough about what these landlords do to vulnerable families that I want to see them destroyed. Plus, she'd added with grim determination, landlords like these succeed because they assume their tenants are too poor, too uneducated, too scared to effectively fight back. They'd never imagine that the single mom in apartment 3B might actually be a millionaire CEO gathering evidence for a lawsuit that will bankrupt them. That assumption is their vulnerability, and I want to exploit it. I'd agreed to participate because the project aligned with my own frustrations about predatory landlords, and because Jennifer's combination of resources, intelligence, and personal motivation made her uniquely positioned to actually accomplish meaningful change rather than just documenting problems. We'd spent 2 months researching target landlords, and Marcus Thompson had emerged as our primary focus based on complaints from tenant advocacy groups, housing code violation records, and a pattern of discriminatory practices that suggested systematic exploitation. Marcus Thompson owned 14 apartment buildings in Oakland, primarily in lower-income neighborhoods with high percentages of immigrant residents, single parents, and people with limited housing options. His buildings consistently had the most housing code violations in the city. But Marcus paid minimal fines and made cosmetic repairs while ignoring underlying structural and safety problems. He charged maximum legal rents despite providing substandard conditions, kept security deposits regardless of apartment condition, and used aggressive eviction tactics to remove tenants who complained about violations. Asterisk, asterisk, Thompson's entire business model is exploitation, the tenant advocate we'd consulted explained. He buys cheap buildings in poor neighborhoods, does minimal maintenance, charges high rents, and cycles through vulnerable tenants who can't afford to fight back legally when he violates their rights. He's been sued dozens of times, but always settles for amounts less than fixing the problems would cost, so he just keeps doing it. The tenants he targets are specifically chosen because they are unlikely to effectively organize or pursue legal action. The advocate continued. Recent immigrants who don't know their rights. Single mothers struggling to keep housing for their kids. People with eviction records who have limited rental options. Formerly incarcerated individuals trying to rebuild their lives. He preys on vulnerability and desperation. That profile made Marcus Thompson exactly the kind of predatory landlord that Jennifer wanted to expose and destroy. We deselected one of his worst buildings, a 24-unit complex in East Oakland with dozens of code violations, multiple tenant complaints, and a history of illegal evictions. Jennifer would move in as Jenny Liu, a single mother working retail while raising a daughter. Exactly the kind of vulnerable tenant Marcus typically exploited. I'd get hired as building maintenance supervisor, giving me access to document violations while supporting Jennifer's evidence gathering. The operation had begun 3 months before the confrontation that would ultimately expose Marcus's practices and destroy his rental empire. Jennifer had applied for an apartment using a cover identity that portrayed her as exactly what Marcus looked for in tenants. Single mother, low income, limited rental history, desperate for housing. She deliberately presented as someone who would accept terrible conditions and wouldn't cause problems. Marcus had accepted her application with barely any verification, clearly viewing her as another exploitable tenant who'd pay high rent for substandard housing without complaining. He'd charge her first month, last month's security deposit, and additional processing fees that were illegal, but that vulnerable tenants typically paid because they needed housing. Jennifer had paid in cash to establish the pattern of poor financial management that Marcus expected from his tenants. The apartment Marcus rented to Jennifer was exactly as terrible as the violation records suggested. Broken heating, water damage, electrical problems, mold in the bathroom, windows that didn't close properly, and a general state of neglect that violated multiple housing codes. But Jennifer had documented everything meticulously, taking photos and videos, recording dates and conditions, building the evidence file that would eventually prove Marcus's systematic violations. Meanwhile, I'd gotten hired as building maintenance and supervisor using my actual background in security and building systems. Marcus had been thrilled to find someone with technical skills willing to work for the minimal wages he paid, not realizing that my real compensation was coming from Jennifer's company, and that my actual job was documenting violations rather than fixing them. He'd given me access to all 14 of his buildings, essentially providing me with complete evidence of his illegal practices across his entire rental empire. Your job is to make cosmetic repairs that keep tenants quiet, Marcus had explained during my hiring. I don't want you actually fixing structural problems or dealing with code violations. That's expensive and unnecessary. Just patch things enough that tenants can't complain. And if they do complain, document it so we have grounds for eviction if needed. That instruction alone was evidence of Marcus's illegal practices, deliberately ignoring housing code violations and using tenant complaints as grounds for retaliation rather than reasons to fix problems. I de-recorded that conversation and dozens of similar interactions where Marcus explicitly instructed me to violate housing regulations and tenant rights. Over 3 months, Jennifer and I had documented a staggering pattern of illegal practices across Marcus's buildings. He routinely kept security deposits regardless of apartment condition, charging tenants for damages that were actually normal wear or pre-existing problems. He charged illegal fees for everything from parking to garbage collection to administrative costs that were unpermitted under Oakland's rental ordinances. He ignored repair requests unless they threatened his property value, leaving tenants in dangerous conditions while collecting maximum legal rents. Most concerningly, Marcus systematically discriminated against certain tenants, charging higher rents to immigrants who didn't know market rates, threatening eviction against tenants who complained about violations, refusing to rent to people with certain backgrounds or family structures. He explicitly told me to discourage applications from problem tenants, a category that seemed to include single mothers, black families, anyone who looked like they might know their rights or cause trouble. Jennifer's experience as a tenant had been deliberately designed to trigger Marcus's worst behavior. She'd paid rent late a few times, not because she couldn't afford it, but to establish a pattern that Marcus would view as justification for eviction. She'd complained about broken heating and water damage, forcing Marcus to either fix violations or demonstrate his pattern of ignoring tenant rights. She documented every interaction, every delay, every excuse Marcus made for not maintaining habitability. The breaking point had come when Jennifer submitted a formal complaint to the city about housing code violations in her apartment. Broken heating during winter, water damage that was causing mold growth, electrical problems that were fire hazards. She'd done this deliberately, knowing Marcus's standard response was retaliation through eviction threats rather than fixing the problems, and Marcus had responded exactly as predicted. "You reported me to the city?" Marcus had confronted Jennifer 2 days after receiving the violation notice. "After I gave you a place to live when most landlords wouldn't rent to a single mom with your financial situation. This is how you repay my generosity?" "I reported code violations that are making my daughter sick and creating fire hazards." Jennifer had replied calmly, staying in character as the struggling single mom. "The city inspector confirmed multiple violations that you're legally required to fix. I am not trying to cause problems. I just need my apartment to be safe and habitable like the law requires." "The law?" Marcus had sneered. "You want to talk about the law? The law says I can evict tenants who don't pay rent on time, which you failed to do multiple times. The law says I can remove tenants who cause problems and interfere with my property management. You filed a complaint with the city, so now you're a problem tenant, which means you're out." "I paid rent every time, just a few days late," Jennifer protested. Knowing this conversation was being recorded, and reporting code violations as grounds for eviction, that gets illegal retaliation, that violates tenant protection laws. "I don't care what you think the law says," Marcus had replied, his contempt for tenants' rights clear in his voice. "I own this building, and I decide who gets to live here. You're a welfare case who can barely afford rent, living off government assistance, causing trouble by complaining about normal wear and tear. I want you out by the end of the month." That conversation had occurred a week before the final confrontation that would expose everything. Jennifer had continued documenting Marcus's escalating harassment and illegal eviction attempts, while I gathered evidence of similar practices across his other buildings. We'd identified at least 40 other tenants who'd been illegally evicted or exploited, building a case that went far beyond just Jennifer's personal experience. The final confrontation happened on a Tuesday morning when Marcus showed up at Jennifer's apartment with an eviction notice, determined to force her out before she could pursue legal action about the code violations. Jennifer had been working at her kitchen table on her laptop, actually managing her tech company remotely while maintaining her cover as a struggling retail worker. Her daughter Maya, actually her niece who was helping with the undercover operation, was in the living room doing homework. Marcus had pounded on the door aggressively, not bothering with normal courtesy or notice. When Jennifer opened it, he'd pushed past her into the apartment, waving papers and launching into the tirade that would ultimately destroy him. "Pack your stuff and get out by Friday, or I'm calling the sheriff," Marcus had shouted, his voice deliberately loud and intimidating. "I don't rent to welfare cases who can't pay rent on time. This building is for working professionals, not broke single moms living off government handouts." "Mr. Thompson, I pay my rent every month," Jennifer had replied, maintaining her calm demeanor despite Marcus's aggression. Being a few days late occasionally doesn't justify eviction, and you're required to follow legal eviction procedures if you have legitimate grounds. You can't just demand I leave without proper notice and legal process. Don't lecture me about legal procedures, Marcus had sneered. I'd been a landlord for 20 years, and I know exactly what I can do. You're a problem tenant who filed false complaints with the city about imaginary violations. That's grounds for immediate eviction based on lease violation. The violations aren't imaginary. Jennifer had pointed to the visible water damage and mold. The city inspector documented multiple code violations that you're legally required to fix. Reporting those violations is my right as a tenant, and retaliating against me for doing so is illegal. Your rights? Marcus had laughed cruelly. You're a broke single mom barely keeping a roof over your kid's head. You have no leverage, no resources to fight me legally, and nowhere else to go because no other landlord will rent to someone with your financial situation. So you're going to take this eviction notice, you're going to leave quietly by Friday, and you're going to be grateful. I am not charging you for all the damages you've caused. What damages? Jennifer had asked, knowing this was another illegal practice. I've maintained this apartment in the same condition I received it, minus the deterioration caused by your failure to fix water leaks and heating problems. The damage is right here. Marcus had gestured wildly around the apartment. Water damage to walls, mold in the bathroom, wear on the floors. That's all tenant damage that I'll be keeping your security deposit to cover, plus additional charges you'll owe me. That's the water damage I've been reporting for 3 months that you refused to fix, Jennifer had pointed out. And the mold is caused by that water damage combined with broken heating. You can't charge me for damages caused by your own negligence in maintaining the building. I can do whatever I want. Marcus had shouted, his face reddening. I own this building. You're just some welfare mom squatting in my property. You don't get to tell me how to run my business or what I can charge. Either you're out by Friday with no complaints, or I'm calling the sheriff to remove you and I'm taking you to court for every dollar you owe me. That's when Mia, Jennifer's daughter, who was actually 22 and helping with the operation, had spoken up from the living room. Mom, should I call the police? He's threatening us and he won't leave. Stay out of this, kid, Marcus had snapped at Maya. Your mom got herself into this situation by being a deadbeat tenant who can't pay rent and complains about everything. Maybe if she'd focus more on working and less on causing problems, you'd have a decent place to live. We do have a decent place to live if you fixed the violations instead of ignoring them. Jennifer had replied, her voice still calm but carrying an edge now. And your assumptions about my financial situation are based on nothing except classist prejudice. You see a single mother and automatically assume she's on welfare, broke, and easy to exploit. I don't assume anything, Marcus had retorted. I know what I see. A woman working retail, raising a kid alone, paying rent late, living in a building in a poor neighborhood because you can't afford anything better. That's not prejudice. That's observation. And it tells me you exactly the kind of tenant who causes more problems than they worth. So you're admitting that you discriminate against single mothers and people you perceive as poor. Jennifer had said, her tone shifting slightly from defensive tenant to something sharper. I discriminate against problem tenants who don't pay rent on time and file false complaints, Marcus had shot back. If that happens to correlate with certain demographics, that's not my fault. That's just reality about who causes problems in rental properties. That statement, explicitly acknowledging discriminatory practices while trying to frame them as legitimate business decisions, was exactly the kind of admission Jennifer needed. She'd been recording this entire interaction on her phone, which Marcus hadn't noticed because he was too focused on intimidating her to compliance. Mr. Thompson, Jennifer had said, her voice taking on a different quality now, less defensive tenant, more assertive professional. I want to make sure I understand your position clearly. You're evicting me because I reported housing code violation to the city. You're keeping my security deposit to pay for damages that were actually caused by your failure to maintain the building. And you very explicitly stated that you view single mothers as problematic tenants who are likely to be on welfare and unable to pay rent. Is that accurate? That's exactly right, Marcus had confirmed, missing the trap being set. And if you don't like it, take me to court. Oh, wait, you can't afford it later because you're broke. So I guess you're just going to have to accept reality and get out. Actually, Jennifer had said, pulling out her real phone, an expensive model that didn't match her struggling retail worker cover. I could afford excellent lawyers. Multiple lawyers, actually, because I'm not a welfare mom working retail. I'm Jennifer Liu, founder and CEO of CloudSync Technologies, worth approximately $43 million. And I've been living in this building for 3 months specifically to document your illegal practices. The transformation in Marcus's expression was immediate and dramatic. Confusion, disbelief, then dawning horror as he processed what Jennifer had just revealed. His eyes moved from her expensive phone to her laptop on the kitchen table, which clearly showed a corporate dashboard that didn't match any retail job. You're lying, Marcus had stuttered. You applied as a single mother working retail. You paid rent in cash like someone without bank accounts. You can't be a CEO worth millions? I applied using a cover identity that matched exactly the kind of vulnerable tenant you typically exploit, Jennifer had explained, her voice now completely professional. I paid cash and occasionally late to establish patterns you view as justification for your discriminatory practices. And I documented everything, every code violation you ignored, every illegal fee you charged, every repair request you dismissed, every threat and intimidation tactic you used. Furthermore, Jennifer had continued as Marcus stood frozen in shock for the past 3 months. Sam Rodriguez here has been working as your building maintenance supervisor while actually documenting your practices across all 14 of your properties. We have evidence of systematic housing code violations, illegal fee structures, discriminatory rental practices, retaliatory evictions, and fraudulent security deposit claims affecting hundreds of tenants. I'd entered the apartment at that moment, having been monitoring the confrontation from the hallway in case Marcus became physically threatening. Mr. Thompson, I've documented 47 instances of you explicitly instructing me to ignore code violations, 63 cases of you charging illegal fees, and 22 situations where you've told me to discriminate against based on race, family status, or perceived income level. All of that is recorded and time-stamped. Marcus' face had gone from red to pale white as the scope of what was happening became clear. You can't. This is entrapment. You deliberately set me up. It's not entrapment when we didn't induce you to commit crimes you weren't already committing, Jennifer had replied. We simply documented illegal practices you've been inflicting on vulnerable tenants for years. Every violation we've recorded, you've done to real tenants who didn't have resources to fight back. We just had the money and motivation to document it properly. This is insane, Marcus had tried again, his voice losing its earlier aggression. Why would a millionaire CEO waste 3 months living in a rundown apartment just to set up some landlord? What's the point of this? The point, Jennifer had said with cold precision, is that predatory landlords like you destroying people's desperation for housing. My mother spent 30 years being exploited by a slumlord just like you, paying cash that went undocumented, accepting terrible conditions because she was too scared to complain, facing illegal eviction when she finally tried to assert her rights. I have the resources to fight back in ways she never did, and I'm going to use those resources to ensure you never exploit another vulnerable tenant. We're not just suing you for damages to me personally. Jennifer had continued, we're filing a class action lawsuit on behalf of every tenant you've illegally exploited across your 14 buildings. We're reporting you to every regulatory agency that oversees housing, city code enforcement, state housing authority, federal fair housing officials. We're referring evidence of your fraudulent practices to the district attorney for potential criminal charges. And we're going to make sure every prospective tenant in Oakland knows exactly what kind of landlord you are. Marcus had stood there, processing the complete destruction of his rental empire, unable to form coherent response. Everything he built through decades of exploitation was collapsing in real time, and he had no defense because every accusation was documented with evidence he'd helped create. You can't do this, Marcus had finally managed. I'll fight it. I'll tie you up in court for years. I'll make this so expensive and complicated that you'll wish you'd never started. Please do, Jennifer had replied with a slight smile. Because unlike your typical tenants, I can easily afford years of litigation. My company generates $8 million in profit annually, which means I can spend millions fighting you without impacting my lifestyle at all. Meanwhile, every day this case is public, your reputation gets worse. Your tenant pool shrinks and your buildings lose value. So, by all means, make this a protracted fight. It'll just mean you lose more when we eventually win. And we will win, I had added, because we have video, audio, photographs, documents, financial records, testimony from 40-plus exploited tenants, and your own explicit admissions of discriminatory practices. You told Jennifer minutes ago that you discriminate against single mothers because they correlate with problem tenants. That's textbook housing discrimination, and you said it on camera. Marcus had looked around the apartment desperately, as if searching for some escape from the trap he'd walked into. His eyes had landed on Maya, and recognition had flickered across his face. The daughter, ... she's part of this too? My niece, Jennifer had clarified. Are you assuming I have a daughter and treating me worse because of that? Assumption is actually additional evidence of you discrimination against families. You charge higher rents to tenants with children, you refuse to rent larger units to families, and you routinely claim child-related damages to justify keeping security deposits. All of that is documented too. The confrontation had ended with Marcus fleeing the apartment, his earlier aggression replaced by panic about the legal and financial consequences he was facing. He immediately called his lawyer, who had apparently delivered bad news about how thoroughly Jennifer's evidence documented practices that were clearly illegal. Within days, Marcus had received formal notice of the class action lawsuit, regulatory complaints, and criminal referrals that would occupy the next several years of his life. The case against Marcus Thompson had moved forward with devastating effectiveness. Jennifer's legal team, one of the best firms in the Bay Area, paid for entirely from her personal wealth, had filed comprehensive complaints documenting systematic violations across Marcus's rental empire. The evidence was so overwhelming that Marcus's lawyers had advised settling quickly. But Marcus's pride in his belief that he could outlast Jennifer in litigation had led him to fight instead. That decision had been catastrophic for Marcus. The publicity around the case had immediately impacted his rental business. Existing tenants stopped paying rent, knowing they had leverage. Prospective tenants avoided his buildings, and property values declined as the extent of code violations became public knowledge. Banks had called loans on several properties when they realized Marcus' business model was built on illegal practices that could continue. Investors who'd backed his acquisitions had sued to recover their money. Meanwhile, the regulatory investigations had triggered their own consequences. The city of Oakland had conducted comprehensive inspections of all 14 of Marcus's buildings, documenting thousands of code violations and issuing orders to fix them immediately or face condemnation proceedings. The State Housing Authority had investigated his financial practices, discovering that he'd been systematically defrauding tenants through illegal fees and security deposit theft. The Federal Fair Housing Office had found patterns of discrimination based on race, family status, national origin, and other protected categories. Most seriously, the district attorney had brought criminal charges against Marcus for fraud, grand theft, and conspiracy to violate housing regulations. The evidence that I'd gathered while working as his maintenance supervisor, including recordings of Marcus explicitly instructing me to commit violations and discriminate against tenants, had formed the core of the criminal case. Prosecutors had been particularly interested in Marcus's systematic theft of security deposits, which they'd calculated at over $400,000 across hundreds of tenants over a decade. The trial had become a media sensation in the Bay Area. framed as a David versus Goliath story where a tech CEO had gone undercover to expose a predatory landlord. Jennifer had testified about her 3 months living in substandard conditions while documenting violations, drawing explicit connections between her experience and her mother's exploitation by a similar landlord decades earlier. Her testimony had been compelling because she could speak, both as a successful businesswoman with resources and as someone who genuinely experienced poverty and understood how desperation makes people vulnerable to exploitation. Marcus Thompson built his wealth by exploiting people's desperation for housing, Jennifer had testified. He specifically targeted vulnerable tenants, immigrants, single mothers, people with criminal records, anyone who seemed unlikely to know their rights or have resources to fight back. He charged them maximum legal rents for substandard conditions, ignored their repair requests, charged illegal fees, kept security deposits fraudulently, and threatened eviction anyone who complained. This wasn't occasional neglect or unintentional violations, Jennifer had continued. This was systematic exploitation designed to extract maximum profit from vulnerable people who had no other options. He told me directly that I should accept his illegal eviction because I was too poor to afford lawyers and too desperate to risk losing housing. That assumption, that poor people can be exploited because they lack resources to fight back, is exactly why I used my resources to expose him. My own testimony had focused on the mechanics of how Marcus's exploitation worked, the explicit instructions he'd given me to ignore code violations, the discriminatory policies he'd implemented across his buildings, the deliberate neglect that saved him money while causing harm to tenants. I'd presented hundreds of hours of recorded conversations where Marcus had casually admitted to practices he knew were illegal, but assumed would never face consequences. The trial had lasted 6 weeks, with dozens of exploited tenants testifying about their experiences in Marcus's buildings. Many of these tenants had been terrified to testify, afraid that speaking publicly about landlord exploitation would make them unhousable in a tight rental market. But Jennifer had personally guaranteed that any tenant who faced retaliation would receive financial support and legal protection, removing the fear that typically keeps exploitation victims silent. The jury had deliberated less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Marcus had been convicted of fraud, theft, conspiracy, and multiple counts of violating fair housing laws. The judges sentenced him to 6 years in prison, an unusually harsh sentence that reflected both the scale of his violations and the vulnerability of his victims. Mr. Thompson, the judge had during sentencing, you built your wealth by systematically exploiting people who were desperate for housing and lacked resources to protect themselves. You charged them illegal fees, kept their security deposits fraudulently, ignored health and safety violations that put them at risk, and threatened them with eviction when they complained about your illegal practices. This wasn't accidental neglect. This was deliberate, calculated exploitation of vulnerable people. What makes your crimes particularly egregious, the judge had continued, is that housing is a basic human need, and you weaponize people's desperation for shelter to extract money through illegal means. The families you exploited weren't just losing money. They were living in conditions that made their children sick. That created fire hazards that violated their basic dignity. And you did this knowingly and deliberately because you believed they were too poor and too scared to stop you. The sentence I am imposing reflects the seriousness of these crimes and the need to send a clear message that landlords cannot exploit vulnerable tenants with impunity. The judge had concluded, you will serve 6 years in prison, pay restitution of $847,000 to victims, and be permanently barred from owning or managing rental properties in California. Beyond the criminal conviction, the civil case had resulted in even more devastating financial consequences for Marcus. The class action lawsuit had been certified with 284 tenants as plaintiffs, and the jury had awarded damages totaling $3.2 million, plus attorney fees. Combined with the criminal restitution, Marcus owed nearly $5 million to people he'd exploited. an amount that exceeded his net worth and forced him into bankruptcy. His 14 buildings had been sold to pay damages and legal fees, with several being purchased by nonprofit housing organizations that committed to actually maintaining them properly and charging fair rents. The tenants who'd been living in those buildings had received priority to stay at reduced rents during transitions to new ownership, protecting them from displacement while ensuring they'd finally live in habitable conditions. Jennifer had used a portion of her settlement to establish a legal defense fund for Bay Area tenants facing exploitation or illegal eviction, ensuring that other vulnerable people would have resources to fight back against predatory landlords. The fund provided free legal representation, investigation support, and temporary financial assistance for tenants who needed to withstand landlord retaliation while pursuing their cases. What Marcus did to his tenants is happening throughout the Bay Area and across the country. Jennifer had explained during a press conference about the Legal Defense Fund. Predatory landlords target vulnerable people who are desperate for housing and unlikely to know their rights or have resources to enforce them. This fund exists to change that equation, to ensure that being poor doesn't mean you have to accept exploitation. The publicity around Jennifer's undercover operation and the subsequent trial had sparked broader conversations about housing justice, tenant rights, and the systematic exploitation of low-income renters. Multiple cities had passed stronger tenant protection ordinances in response to the Marcus Thompson case. State legislators had introduced bills to increase penalties for landlord violations and make it easier for tenants to report problems without fear of retaliation. But perhaps the most meaningful impact was how the case had empowered individual tenants to stand up to exploitation in their own situations. The legal defense fund that Jennifer established had handled over 400 cases in its first 2 years, recovering millions in damages for exploited tenants, forcing numerous predatory landlords to either clean up their practices or exit the rental business entirely. As I reflect on the Marcus Thompson case years later, I'm struck by how Jennifer's unique combination of resources, lived experience, and determination created an opportunity to expose exploitation that typically stays hidden. Most people who experience predatory landlord practices lack money for lawyers, fear retaliation, or simply accept terrible conditions because they're desperate for any housing at all. Jennifer had wealth that made her immune to Marcus's typical intimidation tactics. But she also had personal experience that helped her understand exactly how his exploitation worked and why it was so harmful. A lot of people ask me why I wasted 3 months living undercover when I could have just hired investigators or donated money to tenant advocacy groups. Jennifer told me a lot of people ask me why I wasted 3 months living undercover when I could have just hired investigators or donated money to tenant advocacy groups. Jennifer told me during a conversation several years after Marcus's conviction. But I needed to experience it personally, not just intellectually understand that exploitation exists, but actually live through the daily humiliation of having a landlord treat you as disposable because he assumes you too poor to fight back. When Marcus looked at me and saw a broke single mom on welfare, when he threatened me with eviction knowing I'd have nowhere else to go, when he assumed I'd accept his illegal practices because desperate people always do, I understood exactly what my mother experienced for 30 years. Jennifer continued, her voice thick with emotion. That feeling of powerlessness, of being treated as less than human because you need housing, and someone with power over that basic need chooses to exploit you rather than treat you with basic dignity. So, yes, I could have exposed Marcus without living in his building, Jennifer concluded. But I wouldn't have understood viscerally why it mattered so much. And I wouldn't have been able to testify with the kind of authentic outrage that comes from personal experience rather than abstract principles. Sometimes you need to walk in someone's shoes to truly fight for them effectively. The legal defense fund that Jennifer established grew substantially over the following years, expanding beyond just the Bay Area to serve tenants throughout California and eventually in other states. She'd hired a full-time staff of lawyers, investigators, and community organizers who worked specifically on tenant rights cases. with a particular focus on protecting the most vulnerable renters, immigrants, single parents, people with disabilities, formerly incarcerated individuals, anyone who landlords typically viewed as easy exploitation targets. We've recovered over $12 million for exploited tenants. Jennifer told me during a tour of the fund as Oakland officers 5 years after the Marcus Thompson trial. But more important than the money is changing the power dynamic between landlords and vulnerable tenants. Predatory landlords succeed because they know poor people typically can't afford to fight back. When tenants know they have access to free legal representation and investigation support, they're much more likely to report violations and stand up for their rights. The fund's impact extended beyond individual cases to systematic change in how rental housing operated in areas where they were active. Landlords throughout the Bay Area had become significantly more cautious about violating tenant rights, knowing that the fund's investigators might be documenting violations and that their tenants had access to sophisticated legal representation. Code enforcement had become more aggressive about pursuing landlord violations after seeing how the Marcus Thompson case demonstrated that systematic exploitation could lead to criminal prosecution, not just civil fines. We've essentially changed the risk calculus for predatory landlords, Jennifer explained. Before, the calculation was exploit vulnerable tenants, maybe get sued occasionally, settle for less than fixing problems would cost, continue exploiting people. Now the calculation is exploit tenants, potentially face criminal prosecution, definitely lose property value when violations become public, possibly end up like Marcus Thompson in prison and bankrupt. That shift in consequences has forced a lot of marginal landlords to either operate legally or sell their properties. Marcus Thompson himself had served 4.5 years of his 6-year sentence before being released on parole. He'd emerged from prison at age 62, bankrupt, permanently barred from the rental housing industry, and facing decades of financial struggle to pay restitution he'd never be able to afford. The man who'd once owned 14 buildings worth millions was now living in a small apartment himself, working minimum wage jobs to survive and experiencing firsthand the kind of economic insecurity he'd once exploited in others. I'd run into Marcus about a year after his release, recognizing him working as a stock clerk at a hardware store in East Oakland. He'd aged significantly during his incarceration, thinner, grayer, carrying himself with the defeated posture of someone who'd lost everything and knew he deserved it. When he'd recognized me, his expression had flickered between shame and residual resentment. "San Rodriguez," Marcus had said quietly, glancing around to make sure his coworkers weren't listening. "I guess you're here to enjoy seeing me like this. The big landlord reduced his stocking shelves for $13 an hour. Actually, I'm here buying supplies for a security installation," I replied honestly. "But yeah, I noticed the irony of you working minimum wage after spending years exploiting people who were barely surviving on similar incomes. I get it," Marcus had said, his voice carrying a weariness that suggested he'd had this reckoning with himself many times. "I treated people terribly because they were desperate, and I had power over something they needed. And now I'm experiencing what it's like to be on the other side of that power dynamic. No resources, no leverage, just hoping employers and landlords treat me with basic decency I rarely showed to others." "Have you actually learned anything?" I'd asked directly. "Or are you just bitter that you got caught?" Marcus had taken a moment before responding. "Both, honestly. I am definitely bitter that one wealthy CEO with time and resources decided to destroy my business and my life. But I'm also, I don't know, maybe learned is too strong, but I understand now how it felt for people living in my buildings. I rent an apartment now from a landlord who ignores repair requests and charges questionable fees. And every time I deal with that, I think about the hundreds of tenants I did the same thing to. I can't undo the harm I caused," Marcus had continued. "I'll never pay back even a fraction of the restitution I owe. I'll never own property again, never rebuild what I lost. And honestly, the worst part isn't the financial consequences. It's knowing that my own kids do not speak to me because they're reashamed of what I did. My daughter testified against me at the trial, explaining how disappointed she was that her father built his wealth by exploiting vulnerable families. That sounds like appropriate consequences for systematic exploitation, I'd observed. Jennifer Liu spent 3 months documenting violations you'd been committing for decades against people who couldn't fight back. The fact that you're finally experiencing powerlessness and economic insecurity doesn't erase the harm you caused to hundreds of families. I know. Marcus had admitted, I'm not asking for sympathy or forgiveness. I'm just telling you that being on this side of the power dynamic has given me perspective I wish I had 20 years ago. Maybe if I'd spent time actually poor, actually vulnerable, actually at the mercy of landlords who view tenants as nothing but income sources, maybe I wouldn't have become the kind of person who exploited that vulnerability in others. We talked for a few more minutes before I left him to his shelf stocking. I couldn't say whether Marcus's reflection was genuine growth or just rationalization for the consequences he'd faced. But the conversation had reinforced something. I de-learned over decades in security and investigation work. People rarely change without external pressure. And even then, the change is often more about adapting to new circumstances than truly transforming their character. Jennifer's story had a more positive trajectory. Her tech company, CloudSync Technologies, had continued growing, reaching a valuation of over $200 million by 2024, with Jennifer's personal wealth exceeding $80 million. But she maintained her commitment to housing justice work, continuing to fund the Legal Defense Fund and occasionally going undercover to document exploitation in other cities beyond the Bay Area. Some people think I'm obsessed. Jennifer had told me during one of our regular check-in conversations. They asked why someone worth $80 million spends time living in slum housing documenting landlord violations, instead of just enjoying her wealth. But for me, this work is directly connected to honoring my mother, this experience and ensuring other immigrants and vulnerable families don't have to accept exploitation the way she did. My mom died 3 years ago. Jennifer had continued, her voice soft with grief. She got to see Marcus Thompson convicted and sentenced, got to see the Legal Defense Fund help hundreds of families, got to know that her own experience being exploited had motivated work that protected others. That mattered to her more than the comfortable retirement I was able to provide, because she'd spent decades feeling powerless and watching other immigrant families face the same exploitation. So I keep doing this work, Jennifer had concluded, because housing is a basic human need, and people shouldn't have to choose between homelessness and accepting dangerous, illegal conditions. And because I have resources that make me immune to the intimidation tactics that predatory landlords use against vulnerable tenants, which means I can fight battles that most people can't afford to fight. The broader impact of Jennifer as work extended beyond just the tenants who'd been directly helped by the Legal Defense Fund. The Marcus Thompson case had become a teaching tool in law schools, housing advocacy training, and tenant organizing workshops. An example of how documentation and legal strategy could take down even entrenched predatory landlords when done with sufficient resources and determination. What Jennifer Liu did was demonstrate that predatory landlords are vulnerable if you approach them strategically. Explained Professor Maria Gonzalez during a housing law seminar I attended. Marcus Thompson had been violating tenant rights for decades, had been sued multiple times, but he'd always survived because individual tenants lacked resources for sustained legal battles. Jennifer had money, time, and motivation to build an airtight case that couldn't be settled cheaply or dismissed easily. The key innovations were going undercover to document violations firsthand and working with an investigator to gather evidence across multiple properties simultaneously. Professor Gonzalez continued. Most tenant lawsuits rely on one tenant's experience in one apartment. Jennifer's case showed systematic patterns of exploitation across Thompson's entire rental empire, making it impossible for him to claim isolated incidents or blame individual property managers. But, critically, the professor concluded, this approach only worked because Jennifer had wealth that made her immune to economic retaliation. She could afford to live undercover for months without income, could pay for sophisticated legal representation, could outlast Thompson in prolonged litigation, Most tenants don't have those advantages, which is why systemic reform requires both individual legal victories and broader policy changes that protect vulnerable renters. That analysis was accurate. Jennifer's success in taking down Marcus Thompson was directly enabled by her wealth and resources, advantages that most exploited tenants would never have. But Jennifer had deliberately tried to address that disparity through the Legal Defense Fund, creating infrastructure that allowed other tenants to access similar resources when facing exploitation. I was lucky that I could go undercover without worrying about lost income or retaliation. Jennifer had acknowledged during a panel discussion about tenant rights. Most people living in substandard housing can't afford to spend months documenting violations when they're reworking multiple jobs just to pay rent. That is exactly why predatory landlords target vulnerable tenants. They know desperate people can't afford to fight back. The Legal Defense Fund exists to change that equation. Jennifer had explained, when tenants know they have access to free lawyers, investigators, and financial support to withstand retaliation, they're much more likely to report violations and pursue legal action. We're trying to give every tenant the kind of resources I had personally, so that being poor doesn't automatically mean accepting exploitation. 8 years after the Marcus Thompson trial, I attended a celebration marking the Legal Defense Fund's successful handling of its 1,000th case, a staggering number that reflected both the prevalence of landlord exploitation and the impact of providing free legal resources to vulnerable tenants. The event brought together hundreds of tenants who'd been helped by the fund, housing advocates, lawyers, and community organizers who'd been inspired by Jennifer's work. 1,000 cases means 1,000 families who got justice instead of accepting exploitation. Jennifer had said during her speech at the celebration, 1,000 times, we told predatory landlords that poor tenants deserve dignity and legal protection. 1,000 situations where vulnerable people had resources to fight back against the kind of systematic abuse my mother endured for 3 decades. But more than the specific cases we've won, Jennifer had continued. I'm proud that this fund has changed how landlords throughout California think about risk. Predatory practices that used to be standard operating procedure, keeping security deposits illegally, ignoring code violations, charging bogus fees, retaliating against tenants who complain, all of that carries real consequences. Now, because tenants have access to legal representation, we haven't ended landlord exploitation. Jennifer had acknowledged housing injustice is too deeply rooted in economic inequality and systematic racism to be solved by one legal defense fund. But we've made it significantly more expensive and risky to exploit vulnerable tenants. And we've empowered thousands of families to stand up for their rights. That's meaningful progress. The celebration had included testimonials from tenants whose lives had been transformed by the fund's work. A Guatemalan immigrant woman explained how the fund had helped her escape an apartment with lead paint that was poisoning her children, forcing the landlord to pay for medical treatment and relocating her family to safe housing. A formerly incarcerated man described how the fund had fought his landlord's attempt to evict him based on his criminal record, establishing his right to housing despite past mistakes. A single mother shared how the fund had recovered her illegally withheld security deposit, money she desperately needed to afford moving costs when her rent became unaffordable. Each story reflected a variation on the same theme. Vulnerable people facing exploitation by landlords who assumed they lacked resources or knowledge to fight back, then discovering that the Legal Defense Fund provided both the expertise and the support to pursue justice. The cumulative impact of 1,000 such stories was a significant shift in the power dynamics of tenant-landlord relationships throughout the region. What Jennifer created, one housing advocate had explained during the celebration, is essentially a wealth transfer mechanism. Predatory landlords extract money from poor tenants through illegal practices. The Legal Defense Fund recovers that money through lawsuits and returns it to victims, plus forces landlords to pay for repairs and improvements they'd been neglecting. That's not charity. That's economic justice, taking back wealth that was stolen through exploitation of vulnerable people. As I reflect on the Jennifer Liu and Marcus Thompson story a decade after the initial confrontation, I am struck by how one person's determination to honor her mother's experience created ripples that extended far beyond the original case. Jennifer could have simply used her wealth to ensure her mother lived comfortably after decades of exploitation. Instead, she'd chosen to build systematic infrastructure that protected thousands of other vulnerable tenants from similar exploitation. Marcus Thompson had spent his career exploiting people's desperation for housing, viewing vulnerable tenants as profit opportunities rather than human beings deserving dignity. That exploitation had generated wealth that felt secure because his victims typically lacked resources to fight back legally. But when one of those vulnerable tenants turned out to be a millionaire CEO documenting everything, Marcus's entire predatory business model had collapsed, taking his freedom and his wealth with it. The lesson Jennifer had told me during one of our last conversations is that exploitation only works as long as your victims are actually powerless. The moment someone with resources and determination decides to document what you're doing and pursue real consequences, the whole edifice collapses because it was always built on illegal practices that couldn't survive scrutiny. Marcus assumed I was powerless because I presented as a poor single mother. Jennifer had continued. That assumption was his vulnerability. If he'd known who I actually was, he would have treated me completely differently, been more careful, fixed violations promptly, followed all the rules. But he didn't, because his exploitation depended on identifying victims who couldn't fight back and then maximizing profit by ignoring their rights. So yes, Jennifer had concluded, I spent 3 months living in a terrible apartment being treated like garbage by a landlord who viewed me as disposable. But that experience gave me the evidence and the understanding to destroy his entire operation and build systems that protect thousands of other tenants from similar exploitation. That's a pretty good return on investment for 3 months of discomfort. So, what do you think about housing exploitation and the power dynamics between landlords and vulnerable tenants? Have you experienced or witnessed predatory landlord practices, illegal fees, ignored repairs, security deposits kept fraudulently, retaliation for complaining about violations? Have you seen how poverty and desperation make people accept terrible housing conditions because they have no other options? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments, bro. Tell me what city you're watching from and share any stories about landlord exploitation or times when someone finally stood up to housing justice effectively. The lesson from Jennifer Marcus and this whole investigation remains crystal clear. Predatory landlords succeed by exploiting people. Desperation for housing and assuming their victims lack resources to fight back legally. But when someone with wealth and determination decides to document exploitation systematically, even entrenched predatory practices collapse because they were always built on illegal foundations that couldn't survive scrutiny. Housing is a basic human need, and people who exploit that need for profit deserve the kind of consequences Marcus Thompson faced. Legal, financial, and moral accountability for harm they've caused to vulnerable families. And sometimes it takes a tech CEO going undercover and an old security consultant documenting violations to ensure that. Predatory landlords face real consequences instead of just continuing to exploit tenants who can't afford lawyers. Because documentation matters, evidence matters, and giving vulnerable people access to legal resources changes the entire power dynamic of tenant-landlord relationships in ways that protect human dignity and basic rights. 10 years after the original confrontation, the Jennifer Yu Legal Defense Fund had expanded to serve tenants in 12 states, recovered over $47 million for exploited tenants, and forced hundreds of predatory landlords to either reform their practices or exit the rental housing business. The fund employed 43 full-time staff, including lawyers, investigators, community organizers, and case managers who worked specifically on protecting vulnerable tenants from exploitation. Jennifer herself had gradually stepped back from day-to-day management of both her tech company and the Legal Defense Fund, transitioning to a board chair role that let her focus on strategic direction while younger leaders handled operations. But she'd maintained her commitment to occasionally going undercover in new cities to document exploitation. believing that personal experience remained essential to understanding how predatory practices evolved and adapted to regulatory changes. Landlords are constantly finding new ways to exploit tenants while technically complying with regulations. Jennifer explained during a strategy meeting I attended, they'll charge application fees that aren't legally fees. They'll require renters insurance from specific companies they're affiliated with. They'll use algorithms to set rent increases at the maximum legal limits regardless of whether costs justify increases. You need someone actually living through these practices to understand how they work and develop effective counter strategies. Marcus Thompson had died 7 years into his post-prison life, suffering a heart attack at age 69 while still working retail jobs and living in the kind of substandard housing he once provided to others. His obituary had been brief and largely focused on his criminal conviction and the harm he'd caused, with his children choosing not to attend his funeral. It was a lonely, bitter, and for someone who spent decades viewing vulnerable people as profit opportunities rather than human beings deserving basic dignity. But the systems Jennifer had built to counter predatory landlords like Marcus continued expanding and evolving, adapting to new exploitation tactics while maintaining the core mission of protecting vulnerable tenants. The Legal Defense Fund had inspired similar organizations in other regions, creating a national network of tenant advocacy groups that shared strategies, evidence, and legal precedents. What we learned from the Marcus Thompson case, one tenant advocate explained during a national housing justice conference, is that predatory landlords are only invulnerable until someone with sufficient resources decides to take them down systematically. Most exploitation persists not because it's legally defensible, but because victims lack money for lawyers and landlords bet on that continuing. Changing that equation through legal defense funds, pro bono representation, and strategic litigation is how we protect vulnerable tenants at scale. As I enter my own later years, having spent a career documenting truth and supporting investigations that exposed exploitation, the Jennifer Liu story remains one of my favorites for its combination of strategic planning, personal courage, and systematic impact. Jennifer could have simply been could have used her wealth purely for personal comfort, could have addressed her mother's specific exploitation without building infrastructure to help thousands of others. Instead, she'd chosen to honor Mother's experience by creating lasting change, going undercover despite the discomfort and humiliation, documenting violations meticulously, pursuing prosecution and litigation aggressively, and building legal defense infrastructure that would protect vulnerable tenants long after her own involvement ended. That is what meaningful wealth looks like when it is deployed with purpose and values rather than just accumulated for its own sake. The story also reinforced something I'd learned over decades in security and investigation work, that documentation matters, that evidence can overcome power differentials, and that even entrenched exploitation can be defeated when someone with resources and determination decides to pursue justice systematically. Marcus Thompson had exploited hundreds of tenants over decades because he correctly assessed that his victims typically lacked capacity to fight back. But one wealthy CEO with 3 months and a commitment to documentation had been enough to destroy his entire predatory empire. So, as I reflect on this case years later, I'm reminded that standing up to systematic exploitation requires both courage and resources. But when those elements combine effectively, they can create change that extends far beyond individual cases to protecting entire classes of vulnerable people from ongoing harm. And sometimes it takes a millionaire CEO willing to live undercover in terrible housing and an old security consultant willing to document violations to prove that predatory landlords are uninvincible. They're just exploiting people who temporarily lack resources to fight back effectively, bro.